Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for being here. I know it's been a little bit, but yeah, the last few weeks have been so hectic. I've been traveling all over the place. There's been, so much happening, but I'm excited to be back and recording videos and sharing some of my thoughts and reflections from some of the books that I've been reading. And in addition, happy Black History Month. And as we are celebrating and paying attention to and listening to Black voices, Black experiences, wrestling with Black history, I think let's also pay attention to the subtleties and the implications of having a month dedicated to Black history. By acknowledging and qualifying Black history, what does that tell us about the rest of American history? What does that imply about what we consider to be the standard, what we consider to be the norm, and what we consider to lie outside of that norm? So just some food for thought, and of course, we do need to pay attention to Black history. It's important that we have time to celebrate and think about the experiences of Black Americans, but just a reminder that it's something that we should be doing all the time, as it's an integral part of American history. You can't understand American history without focusing on the experiences of Black Americans. But yeah, without further ado, let's dive right into it. So the first book I want to talk about is Dreams from My Father by Barack Obama. And just for a little bit of context, this book is written right after he graduated from law school. So I like to think of it as quite detached from him as a politician, him as a US president, and you can critique Obama as much as you want, but I think this book gives it a pretty earnest glimpse into his early life, his growing up, and his life as an organizer, and his struggle and his attempts to come to terms with his own identity as biracial and as someone who grew up in many different environments. So just for a little bit of context, the book is written in three main parts. The first is sort of his upbringing in Hawaii and the time he spent in Indonesia, and his reflections about family and community and belonging. He grew up in Hawaii, and he was raised by his mother and his grandparents, who were both white, and so he didn't really grow up around any strong Black figures up until he was maybe in his early teens. And so he's sharing a lot about what it meant for him to grow up as a Black American without any Black Americans in his vicinity around him, and the challenges of growing up as a Black American or as a person of color in white spaces, in a white family, in white community, and the onus that it kind of puts on the individual to figure themselves out without any help. So this first part is really illustrating his sort of coming to terms and finding more Black friends and trying to really understand himself as a Black American. Then the next part of the book kind of moves on to his life in Chicago. So this is after he's graduated college and he's decided that he wants to become an organizer for the community. So it talks about his life in Chicago, where he really finally kind of feels that he has found his sense of community. He's giving back. He's working on these policies to improve housing legislation and social services in Black communities in Chicago. And then the next part of the book talks about his experience of returning to Kenya for the first time and understanding his roots, getting to understand his native culture, getting to understand more of his native identity as a Kenyan, understanding his family legacy and the heritage that comes with that, and getting to meet the rest of his family, his aunts, his uncles, his grandmother, and all of that. And so the reason why I picked this book up is because I recently had a similar experience where I was traveling to Nigeria for a huge family event, and was sharing a lot of the same reflections, thinking about what it meant to grow up in America, kind of detached from this sort of native history, what it meant to not be able to speak the same language as my family that's in Nigeria, having all these sort of reflections on culture, on the privilege of growing up in America, but also the challenges and difficulties that sort of come with not being in one's extended family, not having that sense of community, and a lot of the time not having anyone to directly relate to in terms of my Black experience growing up. For me, for example, my parents immigrated to the States when they were in their 30s. So they grew up in they grew up in Nigeria. They grew up in a place where they belong to the culture. They grew up around family, and despite the conditions and the area and the places that they grew up with a deep and profound connection to their culture and their identity. And so I think in a lot of ways I felt very similar to Obama in this book and could really relate to his experience, especially with the themes of belonging and trying to figure oneself out and trying to balance one's own history with the experiences of other Black Americans that he's coming across that are that he's meeting and that he's meeting in school. And then also just sort of the fear that he grows up with. He grows up with this profound sense that, he's not Black enough or that he doesn't fit into Black spaces. And he wrestles with that. He talks about that fear. He talks about, and it's almost like, how could you not, if you've been raised in a white community, if you've been raised by a white family, how could you not have that fear of not being Black enough? How could you not have that fear of not fully fitting in? But in a way, maybe that was also something that eventually led him to community organizing, is what eventually led him to get involved into local politics, to get involved and think more about the Black experience and his own experience. So I think overall it was just a really powerful book. I think there were a lot of parallel threads that I could personally relate to, and say what you want, to have your own opinions about Obama as a political figure and as a president, but I think that this was a book that has a lot to give in terms of reflections on identity and growing up as a biracial American, but also as a Black American in white spaces. So the next book that I want to talk about is I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. So in this book, Maya Angelou is sort of confronting and recounting and writing about her early childhood years from around the ages of 6 to 17. And she brings us in into what it was like to grow up as a Black woman during Jim Crow in the 30s and the 40s. She brings us into her reflections growing up in a very segregated town of Stamps, Arkansas in the South. She brings us into, the store where she is raised. She brings us into the relationships that she has with her grandmother, to all these other folks in her town, her uncle, her brother, all these different figures that she has growing up that she has very specific relationships with. And she really, has this fantastic command over the language that allows her to use incredible precision in her imagery, in her descriptions, in her use of metaphor. Honestly, it's phenomenal. And oftentimes she's writing about stuff that's difficult to take in. There's several moments of you can imagine growing up in the South. In some ways you can imagine, but also in some ways you can't even imagine growing up in the South in the era of Jim Crow as a Black woman, all the adversity that she's facing. She brings us in, she teaches us, and from her early childhood life, we can take away lessons, we can learn about these themes of similarity, of difference, of tolerance, of the importance of words, of the importance of language and the power of these things, of paying attention to of wisdom that has been passed down through generations and generations of Black Americans that have gone through and faced adversity. Just so many lessons and themes to come out of this. And unfortunately, Maya Angelou's story is not one that is, it's one of resilience, and it's one that is full of adversity. There are traumatic moments. There is so much adversity that she faces. She's growing up as a Black woman in 1930s Jim Crow in the South, and so many haunting images. And as you're reading, you can't help but wonder, how could any child have to face this? How could any child, have to grow up with this? And it's only one experience. And so it brings you in and it forces you to wrestle with and to think about how through so much adversity, someone can come out and write about this experience. But someone can come out of hardship, of adversity, of racism, of trauma, with so much to teach, so much from those experiences to share with the world. And ultimately, I think this book it's a story of joy, it's a story of pain, and it's a story of the power of language, of the power of words, and the power of wisdom that is passed down from generations. And I think in comparison to Dreams from My Father by Barack Obama, we also get a sense into the power of community and the power of belonging. Maya Angelou, as she grows up in Stamps, Arkansas, she grows up in this black community and rarely comes into contact with white folk. She actually mentions in the book that that she didn't even think that white people existed up until a certain age because they were so foreign. And so you get this sense of this child that is growing up within a deep sense of tradition, within a deep legacy of tradition, of history, of community, of belonging to the people around her, even if she may not necessarily, which is clear in the book, belong to the world at large or belong to the country at large. And maybe the last thing I'll also say is that so much of the book is Maya Angelou, when she's a child, observing adults, observing how adults interact, reflecting and thinking about the nature of the world through these observations that she's having with her mother, with her grandmother, with her uncle, seeing how all of these adults are coming together. And it made me think about my own experience, which in some ways maybe might relate a little bit more to Barack Obama's. And that's because I grew up in a household where two languages were being spoken, and that's English and Yoruba. I personally don't speak Yoruba, but amongst the adults, amongst all the communities that I would be a part of, where there's a lot of Nigerian Americans, the default language is Yoruba. It's that is the language that adults are always speaking with each other. So it made me think about my own childhood, about my own experience growing up, and the power of language to keep a child as a child, not only through a parent's authority and their ability to control a child's ways and the way that they navigate life, but also through the language and what the child can even understand in the first place. But yeah, just overall, brilliant piece of literature. Truly enjoyed it, and I'm excited to move on to Angelou's next couple of memoirs and autobiographical works. I think maybe on some of the next ones I'll do a bit of a deeper dive and do more of a video that I did with Ocean Vuong's On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, because I think many of these pieces of literature are deserving of a more in-depth dive into the themes, reflections, the characters, and the lessons to be taken away. And then the last book that I want to talk about, so this is a book that I haven't read, but that I'm planning on reading very soon. And this one is How We Get Free by Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, who is an associate professor at Princeton University in African American Studies. And this is a series of speeches and interviews and thoughts from Black feminists in the Combahee River Collective, which is a group of sort of revolutionary and radical Black feminists in the 60s and 70s. So here she is taking a bunch of interviews and is talking with those founding members, with members of the organization, and getting their thoughts and distilling their thoughts on Black feminism and the impact of the legacy of the women's liberation movements and the civil rights movements, and what lessons we can take moving forward. And I'm just really excited to read this one. Again, we can't really understand power, we can't really understand the world, we can't understand systems of oppression without obviously listening to women of color, and in particular without listening to Black women. So I'm excited for this book. I'm excited to have my outlooks expanded. Just overall, I think it'll be a really nice continuation with some of the works that I've already been reading. James Baldwin, Maya Angelou, even Barack Obama's book. And then maybe the other thing I'm also thinking about getting more into is a few of Angela Davis's works as well. So if anyone has any recommendations on where to start with Angela Davis, I would very greatly appreciate that. And yeah, if there's any other pieces that kind of reflect on similar themes of race, identity, I guess more generally systems of oppression, I'd be more than happy to take any recommendations. If anyone has any books that they've read recently or that they've read in the past that have been particularly transformative or particularly insightful on a lot of these threads, I would love to read them. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. Yeah, please let me know what you thought, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.